The question I want to ask you is, how do we know this? How do we know that there was this kind of violence and that it was real, that it happened?
We know because enslaved people remembered it. We know because mistresses wrote about it. When they wrote in their journals or their diaries, beat Melinda today, beat her too hard. Or when their husbands wrote them letters and said, why did you beat her so hard? Why did you beat her so long that her back was bloody? When husbands tried to corral their wives and said, you're more violent than I am. And it's the same thing the slaves said when they remembered slavery, that mistress was far worse than master. And so the sources are the same sources we use to understand any problem, question relating to slavery. It's becoming clearer and clearer. You know, we also had this idea that even a public space like the auction block was not a space for women. Because it violated notions of domesticity, right?
It was not a place for white women.
For white women, exactly.
Right.
But, you know, one of the work of Stephanie Jones Rogers, for example, is showing quite beautifully that mistresses of white women were there. They were there not just in the audience, but to buy. And so when we think of masters, you know, and the auction block, we think of men handling enslaved bodies, including the bodies of enslaved women, and inspecting them in every place that, you know, they could. And so now we have to imagine women, white women, doing this kind of work, inspecting slaves for their soundness. And there's young scholars who are working on another fascinating part of this, is like wet nursing, right? And what it meant to put your child out to wet nurse, or to have a slave woman wet nurse your child, the impact of that on the space of violence and on both black and white women and the children, no less. So the sources are very powerful.
That's completely fascinating. So how does a child, a white child, male or female, who's been wet nursed by a black mammy for a number of years, and then presumably cared for, possibly even by the same nurse, how does that child then learn to be violent against?
He or she has to be taught that at a certain age, this enslaved child that you've been playing with, who may have also been feeding from the same woman's breast, you've grown up with him. At a certain point, you have to become the master or the mistress, and so your role has to change. And so that's a very deliberate part of the educational process of training up slaveholders.